Hello class, to help us with our introduction with lyric poetry, we'll be looking at one particular poem, One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. That's her picture right down there. So make sure you keep the poem by you just for reference. As we're working our way through it, it'll be easier for you to follow along. So first we need to look at the history of the lyric poem. Originally, it began as songs. These were things that were put to music. That's where we get the word lyric, because you can see this lady over here has a lyre, which you can see in that word. And it's retained that meaning all the way up until today, because you may have noticed that lyrics are what we call the words of a song. But these origins in song give lyric poetry as we now know it, which is not usually sung, a few of its characteristics that still persist. One of them is that it's shorter than other forms of literature. So those of you who are feeling swamped by Don Quixote might feel a bit of a break on that front. Another quality is that it relies on sound for its effect. Lyric poetry is meant to be heard and often spoken, and it's a lot more effective if you do it that way, and that's because it was meant to go along with music. And finally, the language of the song, or the language is distorted. And that's because the requirements of a song, it's got a specific number of syllables, a specific rhyming pattern, the length of the attention span. They all require language to be compressed, to rearrange grammar. They force words to do double duty, because they have to both say something and sound beautiful. So that's why the language in poems is different and often harder to understand than the kind of language you'd find in a novel. So now let's look at some of the qualities of a lyric poem as it currently exists. One of the primary things that sets lyric poetry apart from other literary genres is its intensely personal format. There's almost always an individual I speaking behind or through a poem. Now, this I is not meant or rarely meant to be the actual author of the poem. And even in an autobiographical poem where there's some elements that come from the author's own experience, there's some distance between the one who speaks the poem and the personality of the author, which is why when we're talking about poems, we usually talk about the speaker as the one who is sort of saying the poem, this personality behind the poem, as opposed to just referring to the author. Moreover, this I, this speaker, is very often alone, like this poor guy in this painting. Even when there's someone being spoken to, that person is frequently absent or distant or silent. So this personal aspect that centers the poem in a particular individual, it creates two things. One is an extreme specificity, like this is the words of a particular person at a particular time. But it also offers you, the reader, an opportunity to become an I, to become the speaker as you read it. Even if the personality of the speaker is nothing like yours, you can, for a moment, experience what they experience and express what they express. In a sense, it's the most absorbing of literary genres, because you yourself, in reading this poem, become the personality behind it. So, drama, which we just finished, is the representation of an action. We talked about that. It's something public. It's literally on the stage for everyone to see. An action isn't an action if you can't see it happening. Lyric, on the other hand, is essentially interior. You can't see what's happening inside someone's mind. Often, what's happening and what's being captured in a lyric poem is an emotion, like grief or love or regret or fear. It can also be a philosophy, a certain way of understanding and looking at the world, a kind of insight that can be captured. And then some poems do depict public actions that everybody can witness, but it always presents them through the consciousness of this particular speaker, of this particular witness. It's like they're being filtered through someone's mind before you see them. I talked before about how the origins of lyric in song led to it being compressed and distorted. Lyric poetry is usually extremely short. I've seen some as few as 2 lines long. And the long ones are rarely more than, 3 or 4 pages, when an epic or a drama is barely getting warmed up. But it does a lot with a little, and that's what I mean by economical. And the poems do this by not just using words to get their meaning across, but they also use at the same time sounds, patterns, expectations, grammar, and even the white space on the page to communicate meaning. So nothing goes to waste. Every word has a particular purpose, and often it's functioning on several levels at the same time. One of the effects of this economy is the sense of capturing a single moment in time. Lyric doesn't describe a vast sweep of years the way an epic can, or various actions of a day, like a drama, or the kind of accumulative development of a personality that a novel can convey. Instead, it gives the sense of being caught inside a single moment, where you can examine that particular emotion or thought from every possible angle. In that sense, poems are a little bit more like pictures than they are like a story. Even when poems depict a change over time, and sometimes they do, they usually leap from point A to point B, looking at just those 2 moments in time rather than filling in all the details along the way. So those are some of the basic characteristics of lyric poetry as it currently exists as a literary genre. Now, another important question is, why even bother? Because studying a poem can sure seem like a lot of work. And it can seem like you're trying to put too much into just 20 lines of text, spending all this time trying to figure out all of these different things. So why bother doing this? Well, in order to be really understood, poems have to be unpacked. You know how I just said that they're really compressed and economical? Well, the analysis of a poem, the kind of work we're going to do in class and I'm going to teach you to do, is like unpacking all of that compressed stuff, letting it expand again and get some air in it so that you can see its shape more fully and better. It pulls apart all of its workings into different layers so that they can be seen individually and you can see how it works. Now, what does all this work of unpacking get you? One, sometimes it can just get you to understanding. Poems can be obscure. Sometimes they're intentionally obscure. Poems aren't 3rd grade book reports. So if you don't understand it, that's not necessarily a problem with the poem. It could be that you haven't put in the work that's necessary to get what it's really trying to say. Second, if you do this unpacking work, you can identify its sort of energy, the engine. A poem is as carefully put together as a watch. An analysis is like taking it apart to find out what makes it tick, what makes this poem work, what makes it go. And then finally, you can also determine its value, right? Not only we know what does it mean, what makes it work, but is it worthwhile? What makes reading this poem worth our time? Is it wisdom? Is it experience? Is it a new sight? Analysis helps you identify the source of the wit, the poignancy, or the pleasure of a particular poem. And so that's what we're going to be working on for the next 4 weeks until the Christmas break. Now, I just described analysis as taking a poem apart, pulling apart layers. Another way of looking at it is to think of it like looking at the same object through different sets of colored glasses. Each color is going to reveal something different that you might not have seen. It's going to put a spotlight on some things, and other things are going to be invisible. So when you combine all of these filters together, you're going to get a very full and complete picture because you looked at a sort of a narrower slice of it at any given time. The picture, once you recombine them at the end, the picture you create is going to be richer, fuller, and deeper than it would have been otherwise. Now here are the filters, the layers, the steps in our analysis that we're going to take. One is just looking at the action, what happens in the poem. And this is where you sort of figure out the basic literal level of what's being said and what's going on. We also need to look at the structure, and these are the patterns in the poem. On any level, from single words to whole stanzas to groups of stanzas. In essence, how is it broken into parts, and how do those parts work together? You have to look at sound. As you know, the descendants of songs, sounds are always going to be important in a poem, even when they don't rhyme, even when they don't have any particular meter. Although those are two of the different kinds of sounds we'll be looking at as we analyze these poems. Then you have to look at the language. What words are chosen? What ideas or baggage do those words sort of carry along with them? How do they interact with the other words in the poem? Do they do this in any surprising ways? And finally, we need to look, after I click through all of these again, at imagery. Imagery is the use of sort of vivid sensory description. We'll talk about it in a little more detail later. But it's often one of the most pleasurable and surprising parts of studying a poem, is finding that you can see or taste or smell things in new and unexpected ways. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a particular poem, One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. We're going to turn each of these layers into a set of questions. And you can apply these questions. I've written them so that they can work for any poem that you happen to be studying. And not all of them, and not all of these layers are going to be equally important in every single poem. An individual poem might rely more heavily on sound rather than its structure or something like that. And that's fine. But you need to at least look in all of these different categories to make sure that you're not missing something. So I'm going to apply those questions to this particular poem that we're studying so you can sort of have an example. So this is One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names, and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. So the first step, before we can really get going on any poem, is the ability to paraphrase it, which means you need to know what would the poem be saying if it were in regular, ordinary prose. And to do this, it often works best first to identify the sentence breaks and sort of take out the line breaks in the poem, so it's easier to see sort of the basic, ordinary grammatical shape. Sometimes you need to rearrange the grammar because like I said, poetic language gets distorted, and so the verb comes before the subject, or the object is, miles away from the verb. So you kind of need to rearrange things and put them back together to make them clearer. And of course, if you don't know what a particular word means or what a reference is, you would need to look that up before you can decently paraphrase. And so once you've done these things, it becomes a little bit easier to put the thing in your own words. This is a fairly detailed paraphrase of one art. You won't usually need to go to this level of detail, but you can see not only get a clearer idea of kind of what it's saying, but you can also see what's lost when you strip away all of those special qualities of lyric poetry and try to say it in some other way. So it could be expressed like in a paraphrase like this. It isn't hard to learn to lose things. Many things seem to want to be lost, so it isn't terrible when they are. Practice losing something every day. Accept the loss of door keys or wasted time. It isn't hard to learn to lose things. Then practice losing more and faster. Forget places, names, where you were going. It won't be that bad. I lost my mother's watch and one of my houses. It isn't hard to learn to lose things. I lost 2 lovely cities and some things even larger, kingdoms, 2 rivers, and a continent. I miss them, but it still wasn't that bad. This will still be true, even if I lose you. It isn't that hard to learn to lose things, even if it looks like, and it's hard to write down, it is truly terrible. So the next step is to look at the action of the poem, and this can usually be divided into 3 different steps. The first is the speaker. This is what I talked quite a bit about before. Who is saying the poem? What do we know, or what can we guess about his or her life or personality? Sometimes we know this kind of going into it from the title or from the context. Sometimes you have to use clues, and this information sort of unfolds gradually. We don't know anything about this particular speaker. We don't know if he or she is male or female. And we don't know where they're from or how old they are. All we really know about this speaker is that she, we'll go ahead and call her a she just because it's easier to pick one, has lost many different kinds of things. And that's about it for what we know. The next thing to look at is the occasion, and that's what we call sort of what happened to prompt this poem. Why is this poem being said right now? And if it's addressed to someone, to whom is the poet speaking? In one art, the occasion is the potential loss of someone who is loved. That's what appears to have happened to prompt this particular poem. That's the situation in which you would say this poem. And this person, this loved one, isn't addressed until the very last stanza, unless you count the look a couple stanzas before. Before that, there's just sort of a generic, advice-y sort of feel that's addressed to the world at large, but not to anyone in particular. And finally, there's the question of plot, namely, what happens in the poem? Are there any events that take place? In this poem, there aren't a lot. Really, all that happens is that we have advice on how to handle losing things. And there don't seem to be any outside events that take place here. So the third thing we want to look at is the poem's structure. We want to see how the poem is divided into parts and how those parts are related to the whole. And what's going to be especially interesting is how things change, or how the different parts are different from each other and see if they form any particular kinds of patterns. So the first thing you want to look at are the divisions in the poem. One of the most basic forms of division is a stanza, one of those little chunks of lines that are divided by white space from the other lines. Even poems that don't have stanzas, they're just sort of long and all run together, often have, in essence, paragraphs or sort of other divisions in the poem that you can locate. So locate those parts, figure out how many there are, figure out where the breaks come, if there's a change in address or action, identify those, and then see if you can identify the climax of the poem. Where does the poem's intensity sort of come to a head? And so once you've identified all these pieces, you can look for differences and changes. And there are lots of different kinds that there can possibly be. One is grammatical form, and I'm sure that sounds really obscure. Like, how can I identify a change in grammatical form? For instance, if a poem switches from declarative sentences to questions, that would be a change in grammatical form. That might be interesting. Other changes: address, who the speaker is talking to. Agency, does the speaker start doing something or stop doing something? Or is something done to them? Is there some kind of change in the action? Subject, does what is being talked about seem to change at any point? And tone. Tone is the attitude of the speaker towards the subject. So it's how the speaker seems to feel about what he or she is talking about. So tone is usually going to be described with adjectives like dejected or cynical or elated or meditative or something like that. So look for changes in tone as well as, in essence, changes in attitude as well as in all of these other areas. Now let's look at what goes on in one art, the structure of it. It's made of 6 stanzas of 3 lines each, except the last stanza, it has 4 lines. And if you look at them, if you look at the content of them, you can sort of see a certain progress. The first stanza introduces the 2 refrains. Those are the repeating lines and phrases that come up in every stanza. And so this is sort of the introduction, like, here's my main idea. The second stanza focuses on giving advice, and includes some small practical examples. The third stanza, on the other hand, moves away from those small practical things towards intangible things, things that can't be touched. It also seems to sort of pick up speed. Things are getting bigger and you're losing more. It even says faster in that first line. The fourth stanza has an interesting change in grammatical structure, because instead of giving a command, like lose something or accept the fluster, it switches to a personal value. The speaker starts talking about herself, and the things that are lost also have a greater and more personal value than the things that were discussed before. So there seems to be some key change between the third and the fourth stanzas. And it's also the first hint of a direct address, because there's that word look that seems to be like, it's like there's a finger pointing so that someone nearby can see. In the fifth stanza, the things that are lost grow in size, and we get our first addition and alteration to one of the refrains. And the sixth stanza, well, kind of all bets are off. There's clearly somebody who is there with the speaker, who is directly addressed. There's a lot more hesitation in the language. The speaker seems a lot less confident, so that's a question of tone. And both of the refrains are slightly altered. They begin to change. So these are the things we notice when we compare one part of the poem to the other parts. Now the fourth step is meter. The meter is basically the rhythm of the poem. It's the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. And we talked about how to identify stressed syllables versus unstressed syllables all the way back when we talked about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, because it also used these. Although in the types of poems we'll be studying, the meter is generally a bit more specific. The patterns are numbered rather than just sort of, there's going to be 4 eventually. So let's look at how this particular poem is patterned. The underlined syllables are the stressed ones, and the little slashes, those mark the feet. A foot is going to be a single unit of this particular pattern. It's the thing that is repeating. So you can see, if I exaggerate my pronunciation, you can probably hear the swing of this particular meter. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost, that their loss is no disaster. And you can see that it isn't perfect, that not every foot is exactly identical, but the basic pattern we have is this unstressed syllable, then a stressed one. Unstressed syllable, then a stressed one. Unstressed syllable, then a stressed one. That particular unit of pattern is called an iamb when we're studying poetry. The adjective form is iambic. There are different patterns available, and they all have different complicated Greek names that you don't need to know. But I do want you to know this iambic word, because it is by far and away the most common metrical pattern in English, because it's very close to our natural speech rhythms. It's very easy to write in iambic pentameter, and in fact, if you're not listening for it, you often don't even notice it. Big chunks of Shakespeare's plays are often iambic, and if you're not looking for it, you don't even hear it. The next thing to look at once you've identified that basic pattern of beat that it has is the length of the lines. I already mentioned that a foot is like the single repeating unit of the pattern. And so when we talk about the length of the line, we talk about it in terms of the number of feet. So these, if you count, have 5 feet. And when a line has 5 feet, we call it pentameter. Not surprising. 5 feet per line. And again, that is extended for different numbers of feet in a line. If you have 4, it'll be called tetrameter. And if you have 6, it'll be called hexameter. Again, these are not names you have to know, but I do want you to know pentameter, and that means 5 feet per line, and specifically iambic pentameter, which is what this poem is in, and is going to be the basic rhythm of most poems with any kind of meter that you come across. So it's a term that I want you to know and be able to explain. So once you've identified the basic meter, how does the meter make the poem sound? Like what sound effects does it have? Because the meter is sort of like the underlying drum beat or heartbeat underneath the poem. And what effect does it have on you when you're listening to it? And this is also really important, where is that pattern changed? Because unless it's a very small, sort of insignificant change, just made to make the words fit a little better, those pattern changes are going to matter. Here's one example of this. If you look at the first line of the very last stanza, the 6th stanza, look at how the meter works there. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture. It's backwards. The author has flipped the iambic pattern that she's followed throughout the entire poem to something exactly opposite in this particular line. There's also an extra foot. There are 6 feet in this line instead of the usual 5. So clearly there's something going on here. This is a big deal. We need to pay attention to this particular line. Now, if you're feeling panicked about having to do this. Like this, by the way, when you figure out the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, is called scanning a poem. You will not have to scan all of the poems we do. You will not even be responsible for figuring out the meter on your own necessarily. What I'm going to want you to be able to do is identify and explain, like, if I tell you, look, this last line of the last stanza has a different metrical pattern than the rest of it, what could that mean and why would the author be doing that? You will be able to talk about that in an intelligent sort of way and be able to understand how the author is using meter to help her get her point across. And that's what I really want you to focus on when you think about meter. How is it being used? What does it do and what does it accomplish? Not just figure out sort of the mathematical mechanics of it. So once you've looked at meter, next we need to look at rhyme and other sounds. And rhyme is often what initially comes to mind for many people when they think about poetry. Like, they think, well, what's a poem? Well, something that rhymes. One, that's pretty much not true. But two, it does sort of remind us that it says, hey, this is a poem, guys. You can't miss it the way you can miss the sort of more moderate things like meter. So first thing you need to look at is what words rhyme. In One Art, we only have 2 rhymes in the entire poem that are repeated. So we have the sort of ent rhymes, intent, spent, meant, went, continent, and evident. And then all of the others rhyme basically with master to a greater or less degree, and disaster, which is an impressive accomplishment. English just doesn't have that many rhymes. I particularly liked the use of last or as a rhyme for disaster. Then once you know what words rhyme, you look at the rhyme pattern. So how are those rhymes arranged? In these 3-line stanzas, rhymes are arranged in an A, B, A pattern. And you know from our study of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight what that means. The exception is the last stanza, which has 4 lines and uses an A, B, A pattern. So it just adds on an extra A line in that last stanza. So once you've identified that, you look and see if there are any repeated vowel or consonant sounds. What other sound effects are there? We've talked about alliteration. We talked about that quite a bit in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. You can also look for assonance, which is a word you need to know. And that's basically like alliteration, but it applies more to vowel sounds in the middle of a word. So if 2 words have the same sort of long O sound, it's something you'll be able to hear, and what that's called is assonance. And in this particular poem, the only sort of prominent sound feature besides the rhyme, which is, like I said, pretty impressive, is there's an alliterated L sound. And that's partly because the word lost or losing comes up so often, like it's just the same word, so the same beginning sound appears frequently. And then the other word that starts to appear in the 4th stanza is loved, or the variant lovely. That those alliterate both with each other and that lost and losing sort of theme. And the reason we bother looking at the rhymes, besides that it makes it sounds nice, are that rhymes sort of bring conclusiveness, like the sense of an ending. You know you're at the end of a line if you hit a rhyme. It also links words together. It encourages you to say, hey, look at this pair of things, because they both rhyme with each other. It says these are a match in one way or another. So when you're thinking about rhymes, once you've identified the rhyme pattern and what words rhyme, take a look at them and see if there's any sort of interesting information to be gotten from the way those words are paired up. Okay, now the sixth step is one of the longest and also hardest to pin down at all the steps, and that's where you look at the language of a particular poem. And the first thing you're going to want to identify is what diction is being used. Now when I say diction, I mean the choice of words. Remember that poems don't actually have that many words, so they're all chosen very carefully to produce a particular effect. And often they're chosen sort of as a set, like what type of words are being used. Are they really fancy multisyllable words? Are they slangy words? Are they everyday words? Or is there a mix of all of them? So diction sort of answers all those questions. And one of the most remarkable things about this particular poem, One Art, is the simplicity and sort of everydayness of its diction. There isn't a single word here, except for maybe realms, that you wouldn't use in an ordinary, everyday conversation, with your mom. These are absolutely regular sounding words, and what's amazing about it is that she's managed to turn those ordinary, regular words into something that is very highly crafted and quite obviously a very formal poem. I mean, she even uses contractions, right? She says isn't hard to master rather than is not. So there's a casualness to the choice of the words she's actually used that almost pulls against the formality of how highly structured the poem itself is. Next, look for any unusual arrangements of words, like the things that strike you and say, I wouldn't have used that word that way, or this doesn't seem to fit with its surroundings, or there's something interesting or something I don't understand. And some words that you might look at in this particular poem to answer that question would be that phrase, last or next to last. That's interesting because, well, first she says last, and then she sort of changes her mind. There's an uncertainty there, like, well, maybe it's my next to last. She's just not sure. And then there's that interesting verb shan't in the very last stanza. Maybe I should have included that as another example of a word you wouldn't use in a conversation with your mom. That one seems slightly formal. But what it also does is it sort of leaves open possibilities. Even losing you, I shan't have lied. It feels defensive. Like, it really wouldn't have been a lie, I promise. That sort of adds to the pressure in that final stanza. And then, probably the most interesting kind of language choice in the poem is that interruption with the parentheses. That last stanza is interrupted twice with parentheses, and this is the last one, but it says, write it. And it's almost like it's a command to herself, to the speaker, like, you have to write this down, you have to say this word. And that's just a really interesting choice. It adds a lot of drama to that last line. Another thing to look for when you're studying language is, are there any predominating parts of speech? And I'm sure you're thinking, you've got to be kidding me. Predominating parts of speech? Well, just look at the poem through that lens briefly and you might start to notice things. For instance, the fourth and fifth stanzas begin with an I that has never appeared before. So we're beginning to find out more about this speaker. And in fact, in the fourth stanza, where we first see that I, the adjectives change from, things like door keys or badly spent to being very personal and expressions of value as opposed to just descriptions. My mother's watch, my loved houses. So the choice of adjectives has changed in that particular stanza, so we can tell that something's happening here. Another thing to look for, and this is probably easier than looking at grammatical changes, is what words are repeated And if they are repeated, how does the context change? How does the meaning change as it's repeated? Or does it mean the same thing every time it crops up? In one art, we have some repetition, first in line 7, then practice losing farther, losing faster. We have a little bit of alliteration there as well, but we have the repeating of losing sort of one right after the other. And so you get the sense that the losing is happening ever more frequently, right? Because they come so close together. And in line 19, that's the very last line of the poem, if you take out that parentheses, and what a parentheses always means as far as the grammar of a sentence goes is that you can still take it out and the sentence makes sense. He says, though it may look like disaster. So that like is repeated. It's almost like the author is sort of stammering or stuttering in that last line, which is an interesting observation. Then look at the particular words and see if there are any that sort of are connected by some kind of common theme or thread. In this poem, you might look at the language in the 5th stanza and say they're all sort of geographical, right? Cities, realms, rivers, a continent. We're talking in terms of maps here. So it's both larger than what we had been talking about before, but also less specific. And then finally, are any of the statements ironic? Now, in a lyric poem, we're going to be primarily dealing with verbal irony, but you can look for other kinds of irony too. And there is some of that in this poem. For instance, when she says, especially at the end of the 5th stanza, I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I own, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. You kind of think, you lost a continent and it wasn't a disaster? Really? The connection between what she's claiming, that it wasn't a disaster, and what she's actually described, losing cities, or in the previous stanza, losing houses, isn't a disaster. You think, I'm not quite sure I believe you. You might not be saying exactly what you mean to be understood. And the other interesting word that indicates a level of irony is in that final stanza. Said, it's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master. It's almost like the poet is protesting too much. See, clearly, I have proved it to you that the art of losing's not too hard to master. It's like she's saying it's even more certain than it ever has been. She's introducing this word evident when her own language and the things that she's lost make it less and less certain that she is going to be able to master this particular disaster. And finally, you're going to want to look at the imagery of a poem. Now, imagery, as we use it in a literature class, is the literary use of vivid and descriptive sensory details. So sensory means can be detected by your 5 senses, especially those which illuminate or establish connections with ideas or emotions. So imagery in its fullest sense isn't just going to give you an idea of how something smelled or how it looked, but there's going to be some sort of meaning behind it. It's not necessarily the same as a symbol, where there's a physical object that represents something immaterial. But there's something about imagery that is able to convey more than just the experience of, seeing or hearing it. And when you look at images, one of the first things you're going to need to figure out is this imagery describing something physical, something material, or is it describing something immaterial, an idea or a value or something like that? Are the descriptions that are used those you would expect, or is there something unusual about them? Does there seem to be any kind of connections between the images? Is there an image that keeps cropping up in more than one place? And then finally consider the possibility that an image is a symbol, that it could in fact be representing some non-material idea. And also look for figurative language. Now, this is also one of the major things that's connected or is used particularly heavily in poetry. We defined metaphor and simile in our last class, so you should know what those mean. Those are two of the most frequently used figures of speech, types of figurative language. Another very common one is personification, which is when something that isn't a person is made into or described as something that is not a person, or it is described as a person. So, if a fog is described as coming in on cat's feet, right, that would be personification, even though there's not actually a person involved, because it's turning an inanimate object into an animate one. Or if, say the trees are described as reaching into the sky, they can't actually reach. They're trees. They don't move. So that would be a type of personification. Now, what's interesting about one art is that there are very few images, and this is quite unusual for a poem. So that sort of makes it interesting. All we really have for its images is that first description of the things we should lose, right, except the fluster of lost door keys and the hour badly spent. So the first concrete thing we have is the door keys, which are physical, material things, but it's immediately paired with something that, while it can be lost, it's not lost in the way the door keys are, namely that it's somewhere and you just need to find it, right? It's something that's wasted, that's gone and can't be brought back because it's not a material object. So that's an interesting pairing to sort of come at the beginning. And the only other images we really have is that interesting parentheses right after the speaker addresses you in that final stanza. She gives us just two tiny glimpses of this person she's talking to. The joking voice, a gesture I love. And even that isn't terribly specific. We can sort of imagine the voice, but we're not even sure what kind of gesture this is or what it looks like. But it does give us sort of just a little bit of a picture of what this person that she's talking to is like. Now, once you've sort of gotten through all these steps, you'll probably have covered the big things. But there's sort of a miscellaneous grab bag of other things that can also shed some light on the poem and so should be considered, such as, does this poem belong to a specific genre or type of poetry? There are many different forms of poetry that have developed down through the years, and this is one of them. One art is what's called a villanelle, which is a 19-line poem with 2 rhymes and 2 refrains and 6 stanzas. The first and third lines of the first stanza are the refrains, and those refrains alternate at the end of every stanza until the last stanza, where they form the last 2 lines, and the rhymes are in that ABA pattern. So this form that Elizabeth Bishop chose actually makes a lot of her choices for her. It sort of puts her in this particular little box. Another example of a highly structured poetic form that you've probably encountered before and that we'll be studying later is a sonnet, which is 14 lines of iambic pentameter, and the rhymes follow a very specific pattern. So it's a little bit like a villanelle in that, only it doesn't have any refrains. And what's interesting when you think about the poem's form of the villanelle is that last line is predetermined. The form of the poem tells you what that last line has to be. It has to be some variation that it's not a disaster, or it will not bring disaster, it wasn't a disaster, something along those lines. But it's almost like she's resisting that conclusion, though it may look like, write it like disaster. She knows that's where it has to end. She has to make that final rhyme. She has to finish that final refrain, but she just really doesn't want to. So Elizabeth Bishop makes a really clever use of the form she has chosen in this particular case. You can also look at the title of a poem. Sometimes the title of a poem can be illuminating. This poem is called One Art. What is the one art that is spoken of? Is it the art of losing that she speaks of in the first line? Is it also the art of writing? Because that's in the last line. Are they meant to be joined together, or is one more important than the other? These are questions that are raised by looking at the title of this poem. You can also look at when the poem was written and if it has any particular context. This is information that you can either look up or I can help you with. This poem was written in 1975, so it's fairly modern, although Bishop died, I think, in 1979, so it was towards the end of her life. And you can look at some of the details of her life would seem to fit, or at least inform some of the details in the poem. Bishop lost both her parents early in life by the time she was 5. She traveled very extensively and lived abroad in Brazil for many years. And the other thing we know about Bishop is that she was a very meticulous and very careful poet. She didn't write very many poems at all. The body of her work, even though she wrote poems for something like 20 or 30 years, is only in the hundreds. So she would spend weeks on every poem. The drafts of this particular poem, of One Art, can still be seen and viewed. There are 17 of them. So she worked really, really hard getting every word and sort of every turn of phrase in just the right place. And she did this for all of her poems. And then we're going to take a sort of a step out and think of your experience of the poem, not just what's there, but how you have encountered it. What makes this poem different from others you have experienced? What did you notice about it? Even what confused you a little bit? In this case, what sort of sets this poem apart in my mind is its highly controlled form and the fact that it never really discusses feelings directly at all. It's clearly dealing with an emotion, namely grief and fear, but it never talks about those things. You only sort of see it peeping through in the language and the structure and the grammar of the poem. And that is what I find really remarkable about this one. And then also think about the roads not taken. Remember I said that the poet chooses his or her words very, very carefully. That means for every word that's in the poem, there's a whole heap of others that are rejected. For one particular approach or, view of a particular thing, there's, the other 360 degrees. You could walk around that particular object and look at it from another perspective or another point of view. Why do you think the author chose not to do those things? Sometimes that can be... Okay, some final thoughts before I finish up with this unusually long lecture. First of all, you may have noticed that as I went through these questions and I answered some of them, I didn't make the connection between the thing I noticed, like, for example, the meter, some of the shifts in language and tone, some of the rhymes and so on, and what the author might have been getting at. I just stopped with, oh, well, that's interesting, or look, we noticed something, we answered this question, we saw something. And that's partly because I wanted to sort of put it together with you in class next Thursday, so that you can sort of see how that happens and participate in it a little bit. That's also because that mimics the process of actually doing this with a poem. You don't start with the final solution in mind when you're working with a poem. You just notice things. You say, there's something. That's a change in rhythm. That is a question I wasn't expecting. That's an interesting image. And these things that you notice sort of accumulate over time. They become like little arrows. And then sort of when you're working on putting it all back together again and getting sort of that layered sight that I talked about earlier, you sort of see how many of those little arrows are pointing in the same direction and how they might talk to each other. You don't start out
with an interpretation in mind. If you do that, you're doing an injustice to the poem. So that's why I started with just answering the questions, making the observations. We'll talk more about what that means in class on Thursday. And the last thing I wanted to add was to sort of come back around to that analogy between poetry and song that we started with. Like songs, poetry can just be enjoyed for what it is. You can listen to a song and you can think, hey, this makes me happy and I like it. And you don't have to go any deeper than that. You can even listen to it over and over and over again, and it can make you feel sad or feel wistful. A lot of times we even listen to music, we don't really know the words even. But there's something about the music and the way the words fit together that they just work for us. And poetry can be a lot like that. And if it is like that for you, I encourage you to continue enjoying it. Because a lot of times when we go through a poem this way, people say, well, it kills it. You're just ripping it apart. And that's not what I want to do. And that's not what you have to do to enjoy poetry. Instead of sort of tearing it up into all these little pieces, what I'm really hoping you see when we sort of look at it this closely and make all the observations is the sense of awe almost, like, oh, that's how she does it. That's how it works. That's so cool. Just like the more you listen to your favorite song, the more you notice, the more you understand about how the music itself is achieving the effect that it has on you. And then the more you do understand that, hopefully it will have a deeper and more permanent effect. So that's what we're going for in our study of poetry. If you haven't guessed by now, this is one of Elizabeth Bishop's early drafts of this poem. I think this is her second draft. It's just a piece of it. It's cut off at the top and the bottom. But I thought you would enjoy seeing that. I even think there's something over to the edge of just trying to figure out for words that rhyme. So if you've ever done that, well, you are not alone. I look forward to seeing you next week and discussing this with you. Thank you.